Ready to go? Let's roll. All right. Welcome, y'all. Let's get this thing started. So this is Let's Build a Web Framework. I am Jacob Kaplan Moss. I'm one of the lead developers, core developers of Django. I work at 18F, part of the US government. We build better websites for public services. And this is a class about reinventing wheels. I expect most people in this class have developed a web app before, probably using one of the great web frameworks in Python, Django, Flask, Pyramid, etc. But if you're like most web developers, I think you probably don't really understand exactly what these things are doing under the hood. And part of my goal today is to get you to write your own very minimal web framework, and in doing so understand what the framework that you're using is doing under the hood. And more than that, not just what and why, but think about some of the choices that framework authors have made. You know, when you're using Django, you are using over a decade's worth of decisions. Some good, some bad, some really bad. Those are mine. It's not always obvious why things work the way they are, and sometimes it's not always obvious that they may not be the correct decisions for your application. You're sort of taking a whole pile of choices that have accrued that authors have made and adopting those choices into your application. So I don't really expect that you're going to really use the framework you develop here today, although you could. I'm not really expecting that everyone's going to leave here being going to go out and create 50 new web frameworks, although that would be spectacularly cool. What I hope that it will do is inform the decisions you make in your applications and get you to think a little more carefully and critically about how what the framework you're using does to sort of influence the choices you make within your own web applications. So by the end, you should have implemented a very, very minimal web framework from scratch, potentially without any third-party dependencies if you choose, and understand what frameworks do under the hood. This is an intermediate level course and a hands-on course. The bulk of the time is going to be spent writing code. If that doesn't describe you, you can wander out at any time and I won't feel offended. Or another great thing would be to pair with someone around you who maybe has a complementary set of skills and kind of help through some of the more tricky exercises. Let's see. Let's do some logistics. Slides are online so you can follow through. I can read the code from the back of the room, but barely. So if you can't, slides. All of my code is also on GitHub. I suggest you write your own before looking at mine. I have mostly made decisions so that my examples fit well on slides. That's not a good reason to make technical decisions around writing code, so I don't think that the examples I'm using are necessarily ones that I think you should crib from, but they're there for you to take a look at. And my code isn't great at all. You know, it's done expediently, not really, and for purposes of teaching, not really for production or anything. Let's see, I'm using Python 3.6 in all my examples because f-strings are the coolest things ever. You should be able to do this in any version of Python you like, although things may differ. If you're using Python 2, this is going to be a lot harder. I'll talk about why later on. So Python 3.5 or better is probably best for you. I do suggest that you, like I said, pair up. This is for a couple of reasons. Some of these are tricky. Two eyes are better than one. You'll be able to move a little faster with some extra help. There's also simply logistically, there's a bunch of you. It's going to be hard for me to answer individual questions, although David here kindly offered to help out. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
I guess really quick. Hi, I'm David. I'm one of the Flask maintainers, which is a web framework, kind of like what you're going to be building today.
Yep, and in many ways, what we're building today is implementing sort of the very lowest levels of Flask. I'll talk about that a bit more. Talked about solutions, talked about pairing, some logistics from the class. There's a survey link which you can fill out at the end of the class and tell the conference and me how I did. Please be honest. Critical feedback would be fantastic. It's my first time teaching this particular course, so I would love to know how to make it better. We will have, this is also in the guidebook mobile app if you're using that. We'll have a morning break. It'll be about 10:15. Lunch is at 12:20. I'm going to try and end a little earlier than that, so you don't have to mad rush upstairs. If you requested a kosher meal, let a server know. If you requested vegetarian, vegan, gluten-free, or halal meals, there's actually a separate buffet station for all of those. Power, the organizers did their best. If you need power and don't have it, I do note there is some empty seats right up in the front with empty power, so someone could grab that seat right there. That is about it for logistics. All right, so here's what we're going to cover. We're deep into the getting started bit. We're going to talk about Wsgi and what it is and how it relates to frameworks. We're going to talk about why most frameworks don't really expose Wsgi directly and instead use a request-response style of abstraction. We're going to talk about routing, how frameworks map URLs to callback functions, controllers, views. We're going to talk about controllers and views and templates and the various ways that you might architect the parts of a web framework. We'll talk a little bit about data storage and the various options you might think about when you're storing data, and then I'll kind of wrap things up and take a step back and look at what we've built and what might be next. Okay, so like I said, the theme here is around the choices that web frameworks make. And so some of these choices, and we're going to keep coming back to some of these over and over as we come through. Some of these choices are, do you build everything from scratch, or do you go out into the great Python ecosystem and use pre-existing components? Do you build your own data storage layer, or do you use SQL Alchemy? Do you build your own template engine, or do you use Jinja? Do you want to expose Wsgi directly? Or do you go for a higher level abstraction? If you do, does that map to HTTP? What about WebSockets? What about HTTP2? Do you want to build something that looks like a framework or something that looks like a library? How do you handle routing? Do you use an MVC type setup? Where do you render your templates? How do you store your data? And so on and so on and so on. We're going to keep coming back to these choices. And critically, for the purposes of the exercises, I'm not going to tell you how to make those choices. I want you to make those choices and you to implement the one that you think works best for you. So start thinking about some of these choices. Start thinking about what frustrates you about the framework that you use currently, about what you would do differently if you were in the creator's shoes. The point is there aren't any right answers. These are all trade-offs. These all influence the design and the style and what we do with our work, but they're not necessarily any right reasons. When you look at my code, I made choices that Django made, basically. Why? Because I can implement that sort of thing with my eyes closed. It's easy for me to write. Those aren't necessarily, I don't argue that they're the right choices, and in fact, I'll point out in a couple of cases where I think that they're actually straight up the wrong choices. I also made the decision to not have any external dependencies. The only exception is that I'm using Twisted to serve the actual Wsgi app because the built-in Wsgi ref is, anyway, I have problems with it. But I think that's sort of done again sort of for ease of presentation so that I'm only using sort of the lowest common denominator of standard library things. As we'll talk in a bit, you may and I probably will want to make different choices. So here's what my code's going to look like by the end of this tutorial, where we're going. We have a function. It takes a request object. It takes a name that got sucked out of the URL. We return a response object. It renders a template. We pass it a context. I've got a really crappy data storage layer. This looks like kind of like the sort of love child of Django and Flask here, right? Maybe with a little bit of pyramid going on down there. I mean, it's a sort of mishmash, but you can kind of recognize a sort of prototypical Python web framework in here. And it works. You could put this online. You could deploy it to a cloud-based server. It probably has all sorts of, I know it has all sorts of serious bugs, but it works kind of, and it's there. All right, so let's get our hands on some keyboards. So first exercise is really just about making sure that you've got your kit ready to go. Not a lot of coding, but I want you to sort of figure out how to get started and critically how to run a hand-built or a pre-built WSGI app. So got a little bit of code here. This uses, so Wsgi ref is a built-in module in Python that sort of exposes some primitives for working with WSGI. We'll talk more about WSGI later. And if you drop this in a little bit of, in a file and run it, you should have a server listening on port 5000 that says hello world and shows you a little bit of debugging information. So do that, try and run it, and then if you've got a bit of time left, try installing a real WSGI server, Twisted, Wsgi, Waitress, Unicorn, whatever you are familiar with is fine. I found Twisted the easiest to get started with this sort of really simple stuff. But you should be able to point your WSGI server at the itworks file and the demo app. That's a WSGI app that's built into Python to do demos like this. You should be able to point any WSGI server at this and get it running. And once you figure out how to do that, how to run this in a couple of different ways, you should be well set up to run the next set of examples. So we will work on this for like 15 or 20 minutes. And when you have questions, raise your hand, and one of us will come over and try to help. Oh, okay, for like writing down questions? Oh, brilliant. That is a great idea. Thank you. Yeah, let's grab a couple and pass them out. David had a very good idea. I've got some Post-its here that I'll pass around. If you have questions, just stick one of these on your laptop screen, and that way you don't have to sit there with your hand up. So I'll pass some of these around for y'all. You may want to be careful if you're copying and pasting code out of the slides. The JavaScript thing does malarkey with smart quotes and stuff, so that may be screwing things up if you're copying and pasting out of the slides. So either retype it or grab the code directly on GitHub. JavaScript. think that ought to work. Try going to localhost port 5000. I think that's what in the example. No, I mean in your browser. Port 5000 because 5000 because that's what's in the. Yep, there you go. Do you have a question? Okay. Sorry, raise your hand. Hey, how's it going, Leo? Good to see you again.
Pleasure. Basically, I'm having this attribute error underscore asset. I'm using Python 3.5, so.
You could try just doing server equals make server. So instead of the with statement, do server equals make server, and then server.serve forever.
Okay, so.
And get rid of the if statement there, or the with statement.
Okay, so basically, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I make server equal this.
Make server, and then that's the host name, which we don't care about, and then the app itself, and then server.serve forever.
Okay, so what is the reason for that error?
Maybe in Python 3.5, it's not a context processor yet. Maybe that's a new Python 3.6 thing. Exit is one of the context. What are they called? Context manager. That's what it's called. Yeah. That might be a 3.6ism. There you go. Yeah. And then if you go to localhost port 8000, you ought to see your little app, or 5000 rather. So it looks like this the context processor for make server is new in 3.6. So if you're using less than news to me, if you're using less than 3.6, you can say, instead of this, you can say server equals make server, and then server.serve forever. Just assign it directly. Or use Python 3.6 because f-strings are amazing. Did I mention that already? Yes, sir.
For some reason, it's executing by. I may be using Python 3.5.
Let's see what happens when you run it. Let's case your code. It needs to be double under main. Yeah.
Cool.
That construction basically means like if it was run if it was run directly rather than imported. Yep. And then if you hit port 5000, you should see it. It doesn't like actually just. Yep. There you go. Yes. Yeah, okay. That's that same error as we were seeing before. Yeah, so he's got the answer right there. Oh, come on, don't do that. We'll take about 5 more minutes on this and then move on. Yes, sir.
Suggest what we've done here, we've installed Twisted, and then how do I use it to serve?
Yeah, so I think the bit on the next slide should show you roughly how to do that. You have to set Python path, and then you say twist web -- WSGI, and then you have the path to it.
I've done that.
And what do you get when that happens? You just get an error. No such WSGI application. So it could be a Python path issue,
Yeah, I think that is.
or it could be you could have named it something different. Let's see. You may need to put just Python path equals dot. So Python path equals this directory. Yeah, Twisted does not do any magic on Python path. You have to manually tell it where to find your stuff. Yep, I think that should work. Bam.
Looks good to me.
There you go. All right, y'all, I'm going to move on. So let's take a look at what I did here. So I put exactly this code in a file. I have different directories for each exercise because I wanted to keep them all straight. You may want to just sort of keep editing the same file and building up, over time. I wanted to have, when you go look at my code on GitHub, I wanted you to have each bit separate rather than having the final thing all together. So what this is doing, demo app is a WSGI app. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And this is using the built-in Wsgi ref server to serve that app on port 5000. We'll talk a little bit more about what WSGI does. It's useful to be able to know how to serve your app without any external dependencies, but in the real world, you want to use a WSGI server. I used Twisted. Here's what I had to do to make it work. I did pip install Twisted. Unlike GUnicorn, Waitress, and a few of the other ones, Twisted does not do any magic with your Python path. Recall Python path is where Python finds stuff when it tries to import them. And those libraries all do some magic so that it kind of just works when you run it from a local directory. Twisted doesn't do any of that. I think for some good reasons. And so you have to manually tell it where your Python path is. If you didn't use subdirectories, you might say something like Python path equals dot, as in like right here, this directory. And then twist web -- Wsgi, and then I'm saying it works. That's the module that I put my code in. .demo app, that's my WSGI application. Waitress looks similar. It's like waitress serve. I think in there you would spell it. It works : demo app. Gunicorn I think also uses colons. I didn't try Wsgi. I'm not entirely sure how that would do it. So a few different ways of doing that. And either way, what you're doing is you're telling the web server where to find, how to import your WSGI app. So, what are WSGI apps? Let's talk about that. How many of y'all have heard the WSGI name before? Like, have seen that? And keep your hands up if you feel like you understand what it is. Right. Yes. That's what I thought. So we'll do a little brief introduction to what WSGI is, because I think it's important to understand, and it's actually one of the reasons why the Python web world today is like good at all. So WSGI defines an interface for web servers, Gunicorn, Wsgi, Twisted, mod WSGI back in the day, to connect and talk to application, Django, Flask, etc. Like, Wsgi is why you can use any web server with any web application. I can use Twisted with Django, I can use Gunicorn with Flask, I can use Wsgi with Pyramid, and I can mix and match and switch those around depending on what I want to do with my application. It's hard, like, you have to have been around the Python web world for a long time to understand what a big deal this was. When we started Django back in the day, Mod Python was the only game in town. And Mod Python wasn't a standard API. You had to write a sort of a custom adapter. Well, you had to write directly against the Mod Python API, basically. So when Django was first released, it only worked with Mod Python. Like, you were tightly coupled between Apache and Django. And if you wanted to run Django, you had to use Apache. This is a problem for a number of reasons. It binds you into particular technical decisions. And face it, like, something like Apache doesn't really move very fast. It doesn't get better at the pace that something smaller like Wsgi or Twisted might. So WSGI broke this down and gave us a way to completely decouple how we serve our applications from how we write our applications, and even lets you do really cool stuff like I can run Flask and Django kind of like side by side within the same WSGI containers if I want to. So the WSGI API, it's defined in PEP 333 if you want to really make your eyes bleed. The API is actually deceptively simple. A WSGI app is a callable. By convention, it's called application or app, but the name doesn't matter. It's any callable. It takes two arguments, an environ and a start response. So environ is a dictionary that contains the WSGI environment. When you ran the demo app, you saw hello world and then a bunch of key value pairs. That's the WSGI environment being dumped out for you. This is one of the reasons why that demo app is really nice to have around when you're trying to debug problems with WSGI. It's really great to run that demo app and see what is in the context dictionary. If you played with different WSGI servers, you may notice that different servers put different things in that dictionary. There are some standard keys that are defined, but there are others that different servers will do differently. So that's the easy part. Environ is a dict, keys and values. Start response is where it starts to get wonky. So start response is a callback function. You call start response from your application to start the response, and you pass it a status and the HTTP headers. And then your application returns an iterable that contains the body of the response. So let's look at an example to explain what that means. So here's my application. Takes the environ, takes start response. I can run this with Twisted. Twist web --wsgi something.application. It returns a status, some headers, it creates a status and some headers, then it calls start response. This is the part that it always kind of makes your brain explode when you start thinking about it. You don't return a response, you call this callback function, passing in your status and your headers, and that sort of begins the response. And then you return an iterable. So in this case, I'm returning a list. It contains a byte string. So anything that sort of conforms to that standard is a WSGI app. Of course, the devil's in the details. I mentioned the environment has some standard keys, but also some different stuff. Keys in all caps will correspond to their CGI equivalents. This is less useful now that web developers don't usually start by learning CGI and just start by writing, web applications. But they're fairly standard. You'll recognize the stuff in all caps. Then there's a bunch of stuff that start with WSGI, which are defined by the WSGI standard. For example, WSGI.input is the post body, and it's like a file-like object that you read from. So there's some standards. There's some interesting stuff there. I use this a lot. This incantation right here, a fair bit. Run WSGI ref, simple server demo app directly, so that I can see what's in the WSGI environment. That's going to be useful for you in the next few exercises as you start to pull apart what's in WSGI. So some examples of stuff that's in WSGI. Path info, that's the path component. When we get to routing, you'll probably figure out why that's important. The query string, that's what's in after the question mark, the query, get arguments. HTTP underscore something contains the HTTP header. So for example, if the browser sends an accept header, so that will show up in your WSGI environment as HTTP underscore accept. I didn't fix this. Yes, this is where post lives. I left a note for myself to recall if I was remembering that right. Wsgi.input. Start response. You call it, you pass a status, which is a string, not an integer. You don't pass this number 200. It has to be the string 200 space OK. And headers, a list of two tuples, header name, header values. Okay, so this is where things start getting tricky. WSGI is very hard to get right around the distinction between bytes and Unicode strings. This is why doing this stuff in Python 2 will make your head explode, because the same object will sort of float back and forth between bytes and strings, and you won't be able to figure it out. Python 3 will give you errors much sooner, which is why implementing web stuff in Python 3 is much better than implementing in Python 2. And now you know why Django has been moving as fast as we possibly can to deprecate Python 2. You really want to be explicit about the char set if you're doing Wsgi directly. This bites me all the time. Make sure you always pass a char set explicitly, or you're going to have bad times. And then the application return value, it needs to be an iterable that yields bytes. So there's two ways that people typically write this. One is to return a list, and those will be kind of concatenated together by the Wsgi server. The other is to use a generator and to use yield statements. Doesn't matter, both work. Any sort of iterable works. Do note again, we're returning bytes here, not strings. If you return strings, it will kind of work until it doesn't. And if your byte strings don't match the content type you told the web browser you're going to use, all sorts of interesting things are going to happen. In Python 3, more likely it will crash better. Python 2, fun times. So yeah, few different ways to run WSGI apps. I talked about that. Waitress, Twisted, Gunnicorn. I didn't include Wsgi here, but you could. The point here is that as long as you have an application that conforms to that API, you can run it with any WSGI server. All right, more hands-on time. So you've run a demo app that someone else wrote. Now I want you to write a demo app by hand, directly against WSGI. The goal here is to understand just a little bit about this basic contract, this basic API. I expect this will be difficult. WSGI is tricky and the details are complicated. And I want you to feel a little bit of that pain. So if this seems hard, it's because it is. Wsgi is complicated for good reason, but it's complicated. So here's the exercise. So write an app that displays, hello PyCon. Should return HTML, not plain text. Put an H1 in there if you want to, format it or something like that. get that working first. That should be very similar to the example I had earlier. But then modify your app so that it takes a get argument, so that when you pass name equals Jacob, it says hello Jacob instead of hello PyCon. A couple of hints: you'll want to figure out what to do with query strings, and when and if you start seeing Unicode errors, think very carefully about what needs to be strings and what needs to be bytes. And we'll give this about, again, about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how it goes, and then come back. Okay, sounds good. Mostly it's fine. You've got the sound good. I don't hear any echo or anything, so it just sounds like I'm talking normally, which is nice. Yeah, exactly. Well, the worst is if it's too loud, there's that tiny little delay, and then you're like hearing yourself speak, and your brain's just like, no, stop. Yeah. that's fun.
Yeah. So, have you seen this before?
I have not. I wonder if that has to do with like a Python built with, or a Python built without SSL or something like that.
Okay.
So I might try not using Twisted.
Cool. I'll use something else.
Yeah.
I'll get back to you.
Whoa, that trackpad is freaking enormous. Jesus. I've actually seen one of these yet, so that's great. Yeah. Yeah, all of these should work with the same Wsgi ref stuff, so you can kind of plop that same incantation down at the bottom and just run it directly. It's nice. Like, it's nice to try a third-party server just to see the differences, but it's not necessary at all. Yeah. Yes.
I'm missing something, so I kind of copied the example here, and then tried to call it with this, and it tells me that I don't have the arguments. How do you get the arguments?
Let's see. So what's happening here is you're passing in demo app to make server rather than your application. So that's one thing.
So yeah, that's if I just run on the command line, but I'm doing waitress serve.
Oh, yeah.
I could do this way. And
Wait, hang on, yeah, let's see.
If I do that, it works.
Oh, that does.
Here like this, and then I see the query string.
Interesting. Well, let me see your code again.
So it's just making another one to call it directly. But am I supposed to be passing it?
No, the Wsgi server should be passing that in.
Okay, well maybe then it's something with waitress.
That ought to work. Can you try running with waitress again?
Switch to application.
Okay, so it's saying app equals app.
App equals app. I don't know where it got that. Because I didn't say that.
I'm not sure. Are you like? I feel silly asking this. Are you sure that this is like saved and such that it's? Oh wait.
Oh, maybe that was it. Maybe I just did the wrong thing.
Oh, dash s call. Yeah. You don't need dash s call. That's
Okay,
it.
perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I was just blind.
Yeah.
Oh, come on. Yes, I would be happy to. What's up?
Sure, I'm just going to test this with Twisted here, and I'm just making sure that obviously I'm not
Yeah.
correctly, but that doesn't seem to work.
What happens when you run that?
Just gives me the output like that.
I think, so my best guess is it has to do with Python path. So try at the beginning of that line doing Python path in all caps.
Oh shit.
Oh, there's.
What's that? No, same difference.
Yeah, if you scroll up to the top, at the top of that, there's probably a message saying like no such Wsgi application.
Okay.
So that's because Twisted isn't doing anything special with the path. So if you do Python path equals no underscore, just one word. Yep, equals dot.
Like that?
Yeah, I think that ought to work. There you go.
Thank you very much.
Yep. What IDE are you using there? That's PyCharm? Gotcha.
Simple server, the make server,
Mm-hmm.
and the query string was empty. Both of us. We both tried the alternatives, and that adds up many. So if people have problems with that.
Interesting. I didn't see that. I wonder what the deal with that is.
Yeah. Independently, both happen.
Yeah, I am not doubting you. This is one of the reasons I don't use Wsgi graph.
I'm trying with waitress and it works fine.
Okay, interesting. I wonder why that is. I wonder what it's doing. I'm gonna see if I can reproduce that. Okay. Okay.
She was wondering if like the slides were up.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. I'll switch back real quick to the. Who was it? Was the woman on the end here? Gotcha. Hey, David told me we came in a bit late. So the slides are online right there, so you can kind of start and work through and catch up. We are jacobian.github.io/PyCon 2017. Yeah, there you go. So you should be able to work through these. We are right now doing exercise 2.1, so it's about 15 or 20 slides in, so you can kind of work through the first ones if you want. I'm happy to step back and help you when we're doing the work time on previous stuff. Just let me know if you get stuck. Awesome.
Alright, so I have the basic code up. I think this is correct.
And that works.
I'm trying to run it with, maybe I'm just running this wrong with waitress.
Yeah, you don't pass a path.
Okay.
It's the format is like Python module : application name. So if that's in, so this is in a file custom.py.
Yes.
So you would do something like custom : and the name of whatever you called your app.
That would be
Application, yeah.
application.
Let's see what that does.
Alright.
Let's see if that works. Yeah.
80, 80.
So it seems right. Let's see if we get something there. Bam.
Thank
Good
you.
stuff. Yep.
Can you mix an F string with a B? Do like an FB?
Nope.
Or do you have to encode it?
Yep.
Yeah, I was trying to blow them up.
I know. I was like, that should work. It doesn't work. Nope. You got to do an f string and then call encode on it. Yeah, f strings only work on strings for reasons I think I understand, but anyway, I'm not totally sure. Because you can do it with like regexes, right? You can do RB, or raw strings rather. You can do RB, but not, yeah, so I don't know. Yes.
I realized you
Hey.
can have many elements.
There
like-
you can.
Yeah. So it's normally, what is the actual approach when you have many?
It's a great question. What do you think you should do?
Yeah, in my case, I probably won't. Will have only one element, so it doesn't matter. But I don't know how many elements.
Yep.
I normally won't return the first, but I'm not sure that it's not a problem I had.
Yeah.
Before, to be
Yep.
honest.
Yeah. So if you take a look at Django, Django does something a little bit interesting, which is that the query dict that Django uses, if you just subscript it, you just get the first element, but then there's a different API you can call .getList to get all of them. So it has a thing that looks like a dictionary, but also has APIs to return everything. I mean, I chose this example very, very deliberately because this is one of the things that when you haven't seen Wsgi before, you go, wait, what? Why is this happening? And then it starts to make sense after you think about it for a bit. But it's a tricky one. I'll grab you. Hi. Hey, nice.
So the thing that's weird is that, like, okay, if I do Carol, that comes in with the correct, like, uppercase.
Uh-huh.
But then if I originally did my name with a lowercase, but now it keeps going to
It keeps redirecting. It's probably your browser doing something weird. That's my best guess. Try an incognito window and see if it still does that. My best guess is it's Chrome trying to be clever.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
Chrome. Yep. Browsers cache things in ways that you don't expect them to. Yeah. So we'll take about 5 more minutes here. So if you have questions, let us know. Yes. Sure.
If there's any auto reload option on that twisted line?
I don't think so. It seems like something Twisted wouldn't do.
Okay, fair enough.
Part of that, like, no magic principle. But I'm not sure. Well, they're like, we already have deferred, so like we used our magic budget. Yes.
I put like breakpoint here, so it hits 2 times. There, I don't know why it hits. So when I hit the page, it comes here.
Uh-huh.
Which is correct, right?
Right.
Then continue. It hits again, which is this time the Python, which is I set the default. So the result is correct here, but I am not sure why it hits 2 times.
I do not know either. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't tried running this with under a debugger before. I'm not sure.
This is green. I am running with Unicorn actually.
You have stumped me. I should have a prize for that.
I want to understand like what is going on.
I would love to also. Let me. I'm gonna make a note of this and try to figure it out. I don't think I'll be able to figure it out right now, but that's super interesting, and I'd love to know what's happening.
Maybe on the twist doesn't happen. I don't know. Maybe it is Unicorn thing might be also.
Yeah, I mean, all I can think is that Unicorn is somehow calling your app twice, but I don't know why it would be doing that.
So the code is that, right?
Yeah, exactly. It looks.
So this is like I set the default
And then you pull it out of the query string. Yeah.
yeah, and then
Yeah, I don't know. Super weird. I have not seen that before. I'm gonna write it down. Try and figure it out later. Yeah, thank you. That's super cool. That's a great bug. I love those. I love those ones. Well, it's a weirdness. Maybe Unicorn hits All right, y'all. I'm going to go ahead and step through my solution. As we start to move through this more rapidly, there's going to be a lot more hands-on time, so don't worry too much if you didn't quite get this done or want to play around with this particular thing more. Again, like, I hope that you will use this as an opportunity to play and explore and not feel bound by the time or the exercises or whatever. And I'm here for the entire conference. If you can always bug me like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and help out. Yes, sir. Yeah, this will stay up for, I don't know, as long as GitHub does. I'll probably make a few light changes. I've been noticing some bugs on my slides as I go, so I'll probably make a slight tweak afterwards just to fix those, but otherwise it'll stay up. So here's what I did. I used urllib.parse, which has a parseQs function, which is designed to parse a query string of this form. One person noticed that when they were running this under Wsgi ref, query string was empty. Oh, what was up with that? Oh, and that's probably what's going on with you as well. You were noticing that when you set a breakpoint, it got hit twice. So what's happening is the browser is automatically sending a request for favicon.ico to try to get the request, but since we're not doing any sort of routing, it just hits the same view directly again. Nice. That is super interesting. Right, and so when it calls a second time, there's no query string because bingo. Cool. Yeah, browsers, man, they do some weird stuff. Yeah, so I'm calling parseQs. One thing Leo noticed, which I'm sure a bunch of other people did, if you use the built-in function, you don't get a dictionary. You get a dictionary that maps keys to a list of values. So you don't get a single, hello PyCon. You get a list of possible things. So you can pass name multiple times. So this is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize when they think about HTTP. Like, query strings are not dictionaries. They can have multiple values for the same string, and frameworks have to figure out ways to deal with that and expose it. I just totally dropped it. I just took the first one. If you pass multiple names, it uses whatever the first one is. Doesn't really matter. I also, let's see, there's no error handling here. There's, depending on, PEP 3333 is not super clear about what encoding the query string is supposed to be in. The encoding for URLs can actually be different from the encoding of the body. That's fun. There are percent strings that have to be parsed. That's fun. There's all sorts of problems with this code, but it kind of works, which is my goal here. What else? Make sense? Questions? All right. So let's talk about moving up a level from Wsgi. So almost every framework you're going to find abstracts Wsgi in some way. Like I mentioned, I counted 5 bugs in these 2 lines of code. And I wrote 6 because there's probably one bug that I don't know about. If there's 5 bugs that I do know about, there's probably another that I don't. It doesn't handle URL character encodings properly, so I can get this to crash using certain versions of Internet Explorer. It doesn't handle multi-values correctly. It doesn't handle blanks, name equals nothing. Weird things happen. No error handling. Malformed requests can crash the server. It doesn't handle percent encoding. URLs allow percent encoding and pluses. That isn't handled. And then number 6 is the bug that I don't know about. I'll give you a sticker if you find a 6th bug in that code. So, and more to the point, Wsgi is subtle, HTTP is subtle. And so most frameworks, and the level of abstraction is kind of wrong for web development purposes. We're working, you can imagine how difficult it would be to write a full-featured web application at this low a level. It just would be A lot of details, a lot of work, a huge amount of time messing around with character encodings. So most frameworks end up abstracting WSGI in some way. And most of them do this by turning WSGI into a request-response flow. So basically, your framework exposes some response object. Your application or your view or your controller or whatever you call it takes a request object and returns a response. Look familiar? Flask does this, Django does this. Flask is a little different. Flask puts the request in a slightly different place. It's flask.request, is that right? Yeah, right, the context, yeah. Pyramid does something similar, but basically like request in, response out. And most frameworks in Python and really in most languages end up with an abstraction similar to this. And this is simple, it's elegant, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like HTTP is built like this. There's a request, there's a response. Like it's really easy to think about as opposed to this start response callback and then iterators and bytes and it makes it really easy to mock and to test. Testing WSGI directly is tricky. You have to do, you have to mock out this fairly complex environment object, pass a callable that gets called back. There's some weird stuff there. Testing request response, super easy. Make a fake request, pass it in. And it's just a really widely used pattern. It's familiar. If you switch from, like Flask in Python to Sinatra in Ruby, you don't have to change concepts. Like you have to change languages, but conceptually they work very similarly. But there are some problems with this pattern. I mean, the biggest one is that WSGI is not actually a request response API. So the reason that WSGI does this business with the start response callable and the iterator of bodies is so that you can support streaming HTTP responses. Most web frameworks don't expose this or don't expose it well. You can do streaming responses in Django, but it takes some doing. Wsgi, wants to expose that directly so that, for example, if you're trying to serve a huge file, you send the headers back and you kind of chunk the body out. You don't have to read an entire file into memory just to return it as a response object. If you've ever tried to do things like generate PDFs in Django, for example, you'll find that your views can take a really long time to load because it has to load the entire PDF into memory and then stream it all back to the browser. And wouldn't it be better, I see some nods, wouldn't it be better if you could kind of piece it out bit by bit as you build it up? I don't actually know if PDFs would support that, but some formats would. And finally, the biggest problem with the request response pattern is that it's starting to fail. As an abstraction on the web in 2017, it's probably not a great choice anymore. WebSockets are a thing and a really good thing. HTTP2 is coming /here, depending on which browsers you want to support. And this very simplistic model of one request, one response is starting to break down. If you followed the development of channels in Django, that sort of has been our response to trying to break this request response, one in, one out sort of pattern, which is sort of falling apart on the web today. If I was building a new web framework starting today, I would not choose a request response abstraction. I don't think it's appropriate anymore. I don't know what I would choose instead. All right, so the next exercise is build a request response abstraction or something else. If you think you can do something else, go for it. I would love to see it. But request response is probably easiest and will probably map best to your conception of how current web frameworks work. So here's a little stub of what this might look like. You'll want to write a request object. You'll want to write a response object. You'll probably need to give them a few properties. Your response object might need a .status to return the status code or the status string. You might think about how your response object maps to an iterator. Then you will need to take some way of converting a request response style function that takes a request and returns a response into a WSGI app. I did this using a decorator, which kind of works like this. You write a WSGI app that takes a function and returns a WSGI application, and then you decorate your function like this. There are some other ways of doing that, and you can explore those if you choose. But basically what you're going to need to do to make this work is write a function, takes a request and returns a response, and then wrap it, either with a decorator or in some other way, so that it looks like a WSGI app with the environ and start response, and then stream it out. Let us dive in. So logistically, we have the break starts in about 10 minutes. So what I suggest is let's start up again around. I'll start up again around 10:45. Although depending on where people are, I may give a bit more time working on this. I'm just going to hang out here, so feel free to work until you reach a good stopping point. Run out, get your break, come back, work a little more. This is a fairly complex bit of coding. This might be a good place where you may want to click over and check out what I've done to see some help. Especially the decorator can be a little bit tricky if you haven't written decorators before. So you might want to just crib that bit if you're feeling stuck there. The important part, I think, for the purposes of this class is the request response bit. So we'll work for a while. Take your break when you feel like it. I'll start up again 10:45, but I'll do a little, check in at that point to see if we should spend a little longer on the exercise past then or move on.
Previous example, what I did was I can actually run it locally. Run it
Using Wsgi ref.
so that was actually okay. So here we go. So this is really your example.
And that's working for you?
It is, and then
Okay.
I'll just confirm that.
Yep. Okay.
So that's fine.
And you changed the port to 5020 there, just double checking that we're looking at the right thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Just making sure we're looking at the right one.
Absolutely. And then your colleague suggested I try G Unicorn. And I did that, and it's something to do with the stream. And I thought maybe it was using Python 2, but it isn't. You can see that it's using Python 3.5.
Weird.
Really
Oh yeah, no, it is 3.5 is doesn't support f strings. So it is using a different
So
version of
I
Python.
actually need 3.6.
Yeah, f strings are new in 3.6.
Okay,
Yeah.
of course. Okay, great. All right.
Yep. Really, this whole class is just an elaborate advertisement for f strings. That's one way to do it, yeah. And you definitely don't need to literally map everything. I think I just mapped just just a couple of the, exactly. That's one way to do it. There are a few other ways, but that's probably the easiest way. Hey, got a question? What can I help you with?
Sorry,
Oh,
I
that?
don't have a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I refuse. I didn't take that down.
Oh, gotcha. Cool.
problem. So I've now, I've got an environment in which I'm running 3.6. And for some reason, it's still looking.
What happens when you say which G unicorn?
That's a great question.
Huh.
It's really wacky. And the thing is, if I do,
Yeah, something about G unicorn itself.
see, that's cool, right? So
And that works.
yeah. So
But somehow, something about how you've installed G unicorn, it's picking up your 3.5 install instead.
but it wasn't, right? It was, well, I mean, essentially it was, but when I did, which it looks in this,
That does seem to be correct, yeah.
yeah. So maybe I'll just try to keep serving up like this. And
Either, or yeah, I don't know.
yeah.
Virtual env.
Have you had any ideas? Because I don't want to spend too much time on this.
I mean, I don't use Conda. I use PyEnv, so I don't really know what the I wouldn't be sure what that would be. Like, all I can think is that either like your path is somehow pointing to the wrong unicorn, or that version that you installed like is somehow picking up the wrong one. I don't really know. Yeah, I'm not sure how Conda works. So
Okay. Well,
yeah,
I'll keep doing just using Python.
this is the this is the most frustrating part about Python, hands down. Yes. Because the responses need to return iterators, not. So actually, if you return a string, it will work. But what will happen is the WSGI server will send it out one byte at a time, H E L O, right? So that's why. So I'm returning it as a list to help reinforce the idea that WSGI returns iterators rather than strings. Yeah.
Basically, you have this response object. The functionality of the response object is basically building the HTML response.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, I mean, it abstracts basically. It abstracts the response, both the stuff that gets passed to start response, and also the response iterator.
Yeah. So what this functionality below the function does is you take the application, the response, and the environment, and it returns a function.
You're talking about this, what the decorator does?
Yeah.
Yeah, what the decorator does is it takes a function that has the request response thing, and it like maps the environment to a request object, passes that into the request response thing, and then that returns a response object, which then it like explodes out into a WSGI response.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Kind of.
Yeah. So what this function will need to do, what that function will need to do is like take this, somehow convert it to one of these, call the function, which returns a response, and then taking the response, call start response, and then return some value out of the response. A common technique is to make the response itself an iterator, so you just return the response, and WSGI will iterate over it. But there's a bunch of different, I think that's how I did it. There's a bunch of different ways that you could do that. I left out WSGI middleware because I didn't want to just be crying as I wrote all my examples. It's funny how like the hardest part of this whole tutorial for me to write was the hello world part. Like once I got like when I get past the abstraction, I'm like, okay, now I'm in safe territory. But WSGI just has never fit my brain. So yeah. I know. I still can't believe that like, what a ridiculously good job Malcolm did figuring this out pre-Python 3 and making Django work like consistently and coherently before Python 3 landed, and PEP 3333, right, which like specified it better, because before that different WSGI servers had different behavior, and so you had to like find this like cute middle ground that would work with every WSGI server. Yeah. Yeah. As far as I can tell, there is no RFC anywhere that definitively says what encoding HTTP headers are supposed to be, either in the request or the response thing. And different browsers do it. Like Windows uses the Windows like 1252 encoding for headers, regardless of what the body is in. So when you see a post request coming from not Edge, but any older version of IE, the headers are encoded in Windows 1252, and the body is encoded in whatever the page specified, UTF-8 or whatever, which is not like that's not supposed to be allowed. You shouldn't have multiple encodings. I know but that's what it does. Yeah. Looked like a stretch, yeah. Got it working? Rad. Can I look?
Yeah, this was the only port. I tried to make it as an iterator.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. You might try seeing if you can turn response into an iterator. That would be an interesting thing to try to figure out. You don't have to. Yeah. I like the name of that function.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I mean, basically,
Cool.
the request is the one that passes the.
Yep.
queries
You put
string,
that there, and then you
that's
call
what I use
self.get
here in
in
the
there. And,
application,
yep.
This looks Django.
Look kind of Django-ish, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the
Exactly.
get and the pose,
Yeah.
which-
Yeah. You
that-
can
that
start
sort
to
of
see what's
portion
happening there.
Actually, I was looking at the Django documentation. I was, wait a minute, let me
Yep.
try to get this.
Yeah. Exactly. Cool.
So
Yes. Yeah. So that's the part that starts to get a little interesting.
Okay. I tried that actually, but so here itself, and I guess
So try to say yield instead of, because remember that iter needs to return an iterator and not a, yeah, exactly. That might work. Sweet. Yeah. Oh yeah, dot values in Python 3 is an iterator, not a list. Right, it's that weird. What is it, like a values? It's like a view object, basically, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I would too. Well, dictionaries are ordered now, though, so I think now it's a list again. I'm relying on it. I'm fairly I'm fairly sure that 3.6 like has taken that out of the docs now, though. I think it just says that. It still says that. Oh. Everyone's gonna rely on it. It's not. It is an. It's becoming an API. It doesn't matter. Have you seen, David, the gross hacks that like ORMs like Django have to do, or like forms libraries have to do to make sure that the attributes defined in a class are the order, like appear in the class dictionary in the order that they're defined. So like if you define a model, you have like, first name, last name, and then you render a form from that, you want first name and last name to be exactly. You have a class global counter that every time the class is instantiated increments, and then you can sort by that when you pull the feeds. It's super gross. I know, right? Hey, I mean, like the next release of Django finally dropped support for Python 2. Like we're we're a few versions back. So.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to drop 2.7, but like for the 1.0 release, I think I'm going to try to drop like 2.6 and 3.4.
It looks like someone is coming along to who's going to like sell commercial support for Python 2 versions of Django, which is great. Which is exactly like, yeah, I mean that's perfect because that lets us be like, we don't have to support it anymore. But if you're if you're a company and you're relying on it, you can spend some money on this person and get patches backported. And if you're not spending money on it, you get what you pay for. Dude, look at my code. It's just as bad.
Request object doesn't do anything. Response in here, response object does little. I'm trying to make sure I don't do anything weird. And then
Seems reasonable.
my route object does a bit more than it should. But
Oh, interesting. Oh, you started. Okay, so you actually started in on routing.
well, no,
Cool.
It's not really. Here,
Yeah, you did. You definitely did more than.
this is my route. Take the first
Sure.
one on the list.
Well,
It doesn't actually route.
that'll serve you well once we get to the routing step, which is coming in a few sections. So you'll have that opportunity. Cool. Nice, good stuff. Yeah.
Passing around the request and response bits is hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to, and you really see that impedance mismatch between WSGI and the request response thing because you need like different parts of different things at different points. Yeah. Yep. Right. Exactly. Yeah. If you're not careful. Yeah. Yeah. Which can be a design decision. I mean, like Flask does this context object. Yeah. which you can either create manual, you can create yourself if you're testing or if you want to manage the context yourself, but also Flask kind of creates one for you as a thread local, and you can kind of see why it does that. Like it actually makes a lot of things really much more convenient. You know, Django doesn't, and it makes certain things particularly hard, especially when you're trying to do things like you know, you want to record an audit trail every time an object changes. Who was the user who changed it? Well, how do you find, if like you're down in a model, how the hell do I get all the way back up to my request here? So, yeah. Yes.
Getting this HTTP connection get response error must be called as first argument. I keep getting, first it's getting nothing, then it's getting response instead.
You said you're using Python 2? Yeah. I don't know. I haven't used Python 2 in a while now. Let me take a look at that error again.
Yeah, it's because you don't have an instance of the HTTP connection.
How do I initiate instance?
Well, this is a class, so you create an instance, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to work because I don't know that you can use HTTP connection in that way.
Okay. This HTTP client at Python 3 works fine, right?
Yeah, that's a Python 3 thing. Yeah. So you could just do, I mean, all that that's doing is it's looking up, it's translating the code, you know, the number 200 into the string 200 OK. Yeah. So you could just write your own dictionary that maps strings to statuses that way, and just include, you know, just do 200 and 404 for now. Okay. And then, yeah, that's just convenient because Python has a built-in list of all of them, but you don't really need that for this. So you could just do that instead. Okay.
Immediately start extracting things easily. So that's maybe because you already know how to deal with it.
I mean, right. I mean, like, I have the advantage of, like, having worked on Django for a long time and having that kind of in my head.
Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, it's how I think, it's how I code. Like, I start to think about.
Yeah, normally you do a few iterations. Basically, like I'm trying to go from the abstract is like 3 or 4 steps.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, do keep in mind, like, what you're seeing in my examples are probably 2 or 3, you know, there are a few iterations through, right? Like, you know, I kind of went, you know, I went through this a few times myself. I sort of wrote what it is. I sort of wrote the exercises first, and then went through and did them all, and then rewrote them and did them again, and then rewrote them and did them again. And so like I, was working. Yeah. So you're seeing a few, you're seeing a few steps down. And I also, like, you're also seeing, I've tried to condense things as much as possible so that they're real succinct on the slide. So you're seeing, a version that's good for putting on a slide and not. Yeah, exactly. I've tried to remove sort of anything extraneous or cute or special or interesting just to make it as easy to present as possible. So can I get a feel for how many of y'all, raise your hand if you'd like, 5 or 10 more minutes to keep working on this. Yeah, let's give it about 5 more minutes to keep working on this exercise. We have plenty of time. The chunk at the end on data storage is frankly the least exciting part of this whole thing, so we can leave it as an exercise for you to do some other time if we need a little more time to work on other stuff. All right, y'all. Let's get back into things. How was that? Easy? Huh? Real hard? I'm seeing a lot of... Yeah, it's tricky. From here, the sort of second half of this course is where things start to diverge a bit, and you have a lot of option to play and to do different things. So don't feel confined by following along with the exercises. I know I heard a couple people say things like, well, it's working, but it's really ugly, and I'd like to refine it. That would be a great use of this time as well. Again, my goal here is for you to play and to understand and to dig into things, not necessarily to get, this isn't coursework, there won't be a grade. You don't need to do my exercises. So I'll go through a little bit how I did this. Okay, so my request object is reasonably simple. It's simply a wrapper around the WSGI environment. And so, for example, I have an args function or property that takes my same code to parse from before to parse the query string. This time it returns a dictionary. I chose the name args. It's the same as what Flask Worksorg uses. Someone else called it all capital get, which is what Django uses. You could call it a bunch of different things. I didn't do anything else, but you can imagine what post might look like, what headers might look like, what reading uploaded files might look like. You can start to think about where you would put those sorts of abstractions in a request object. My response object, bit more complicated. Let's see, I take a few arguments, status, character set, different content types. I chose to sort of save a response, the sort of actual response as a list on that object. Wsgi ref has a reasonably good headers abstraction that you can use for HTTP headers, which is nice, so I use that. I add a content type header, save the status for later. I have a status property which converts a number like 200 into a string like 200 OK. Remember, Wsgi needs that. This is like an API design thing. I think it's more convenient for like a user of a library to just return status 404 instead of having returned the string 404 not found. So I sort of do that as a convenience. Python 3 has this http.client.responses, which maps from a code to a string. So I take advantage of that. If there's a tricky part here, it's probably this part. So remember that WSGI apps need to return iterators. I choose to make the response object itself the iterator, and also recall that the values from this iterator need to be bytes. So this is where I iterate through the sort of list of strings or whatever that the user of my library passed in. If they're bytes, I just return them as is. I assume that the person calling this code has encoded them properly. Might be true. If not, I encode using the character set that, remember, was passed into my initializer earlier. This almost works. If you take a look at a real full-featured response object, you'll see it's a bit more complex, but that's basically the idea there. So my conversion function, this is my decorator. I create a request passing in the environment. I get a response from the decorated function. Then I call start response, and here's where I pull out the status and pull out the headers. And then I return an iter on response. I don't remember why I put that there. I don't think I need it. I think that's probably from an earlier iteration. Heyo. Sorry. And so finally my app looks like this. I decorate it with my decorator. I call request.args to get the name. I return a response object. Note that I'm returning strings here rather than bytes. One reason why an abstraction is nice, I don't have to think about encoding at this level. I can just work with strings here. The rule of thumb around like web stuff is to encode, decode at the boundaries. So you want to, as soon as data comes in from the browser, convert it from bytes to strings, and right before data goes back out to the browser, convert it from strings to bytes. And so that's what I'm doing here within this request and response object. Now this was a lot of code, right? I mean, if you wrote some or all of this, you notice there's a chunk of code here, and you're probably at this point thinking, that's a pain in the butt, and trying to think about all of the stuff. I mean, we haven't even started talking about post data. Post data is real weird. So here's how to do this on easy mode. From Wsgi.wrappers, import request and response, request.application, response from Wsgi. This is the same exact app as before, but using Wsgi's wrappers. And this actually works and could be deployed into production and doesn't have 1,000 bugs. So in many ways, what we're doing in this class is building a really, really crappy Wsgi. Wsgi, if you're not familiar with it, is sort of the, what you described as like the underlying sort of the plumbing of Flask. You know, Flask is sort of a set of abstractions built on top of Wsgi, essentially, yeah?
It's like working with Wsgi and Flask for making applications.
Right. And so this brings us to our first big decision point around designing web applications. Do you do it yourself? Do you build everything sort of, you know, in the box by hand, aka the Django way, or do you do a best of breed approach? Do you take the things that exist around the Python community and adapt them and knit them together? And what you're trading off here essentially is sort of like internal API consistency. You know, Django feels like Django regardless of what part of it you're using. But you're trading that off against ease, frankly. Like the standard library, the community libraries are typically, you know, very good and better than you're going to be able to do by hand. And they're going to be familiar if you're switching between, Django and Flask. Now that Django supports Jinja templates, you don't have to learn a new template language to switch between them. You can just keep using the same template language you're used to. If I was building a new web framework today in 2017, I very much doubt I would be reinventing any of these wheels. I wish I could pull Wsgi back in time and rebuild Django on top of it. It would have saved us a ton of effort. So as you move forward in this tutorial, you're going to have this decision point to face. Do you want to keep doing things by hand from scratch, or do you want to build on top of existing abstractions? If you want the remainder of the exercises to be easy, and if you want your code to be high quality and capable of being deployed to production, take the best of breed approach. If you want the rest of the exercises to be difficult, and you want to try to stretch yourself to only use what's in the standard library and to really learn some of the details of how some of this stuff works at a deep level, try not using third-party libraries. The choice is yours. Okay, so we have not really yet built a framework. Nor have we really defined a framework. So I define a framework in a very simple way. It's about who's in control, who calls whom. So if you've used Django, you know that you write some URLs, you write some models, you write some views, you write a bunch of templates, but there's no like, you run Django and you say, hey Django, here's my app. But Django sort of calls into your app. You don't call into Django, Django calls you, right? And depending on, there's a whole bunch of different ways in which that might happen, a whole bunch of different APIs that are provided, but your app is on the receiving end of the call. On the flip side, if you use Flask, you notice you import Flask, you call Flask, you say something like flask.run, flask.route, you create an app, you're calling the APIs one kind of bit by bit, and then your code is sort of running. So you're in control, you're calling back out into the library. So I would call the Django style kind of more frameworky, and I would call the Flask style more library-ish. Do you agree? I think Flask is a weird middle ground, but I think it's a good way of thinking about the difference.
I consider it a framework, but it's just taking a different approach. Django tries to be like auto-detector thing. Flask says
you have to call a bunch of APIs, yeah. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So right now we have something that's we don't really even have a library. Right now we have some hand-rolled code. One of the big problems with frameworks, as David just alluding to, is like, how does your framework know how to call your app? Like you run Python, start Django, and how does Django know which app is running. Like Flask is very explicit about this. You run your app, and it tells Flask where all the bits are, but Django calls into you in a bunch of different ways. And this sort of startup problem, you understand why Django settings module exists now. It's to sort of solve this startup problem, to tell Django, here is my app, as opposed to a more library-ish way of saying, start Django with a bunch of stuff here. So your next decision point is going to be, do you want what you're building to be a framework or a library? And that's the next exercise here, which is to refactor your code from what you've probably got in a single file into some sort of reusable library or framework. So for a framework, your app is going to end up looking something like this. You'll import a response object from your framework, you'll define a function, and that'll probably be just about it. That might be all that you need in one file. You could call this app.py or something, or hello myframework.py. And you'll point your framework at something like myframework.application. So you've got a sort of generic Wsgi application that somehow, hand-wavy magically, knows how to call into this code. So you'll have to answer the question of, how does this Wsgi application know where to find this code? And that's part of this exercise, so you can think about ways to do that, how to figure that out. If you want to do this as a library, your code will look similar, but you'll probably have some sort of app object of some sort that you create in here, and you'll point your Wsgi server directly at this file, rather than at the framework itself. The choice is yours. I'm going to be doing the Django-ish version because I'm lazy and know how to do that. But and that's the demo that I'll show off in the next step. But you are free to do what you like. So we'll take probably only spend about 10 or 15 minutes on this one. It's mostly just refactoring, and it isn't super critical. You can keep, like, if you don't get this one done, you can kind of revert back to where you are right now and keep moving forward with the rest of the exercises. But I'll give you a bit of time on this one. There's more pairing and people working together than I often get. I try to encourage that because I think it's easier for everyone, but it can be weird to lean to the person next to you and be like,
Web applications from the beginning tutorial.
oh, cool.
Helping out. They're just asking questions.
Interesting.
Actually, I thought like Wsgi would be kind of harder than it sounds. I was expecting it.
I mean, I've sort of skirted past some of the harder part. Like, started going down the post rabbit hole earlier, and then it was like, no, I just can't get through all that.
I know there's like a bug in Flask right now that Encode fixed. Like when you request a file, it like tries to cache the entire file in memory now.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know when that happened. Yeah, there's like a bunch of weird flaws. Are you gonna be at the scripts?
Couple days, yeah.
Be there until like mid-Thursday.
Awesome. hoping to get to work on MyPy annotations for Django. So that's what we've been talking about that at work, about a few of us here, I think, hoping to work on that. So.
We had somebody come in from like TypeShit and say, hey, can I do annotations for Wsgi? Yeah, I'm like, we can't really do them in the library yet.
Yeah. Right, I think we finally can, right? Because the next 111 will drop 2 support. So yeah. But it's hard, man. Trying to figure out how to come up annotations for stuff like the ORM stuff just seems almost impossible to me. So we may just have to like peace out at that point.
I don't think C++ is going to even try to do annotations. I think they're doing like some tests where it's like, if you know how to.
Yeah.
Go for it.
What was that? Yeah. Yep. Oh, Russ's talk.
It's like, that's a pretty smart idea because you're annotating that like spec side.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Twist Biosciences yesterday, and they were talking about they're using this framework on top of Falcon that uses type annotations to know how to dispatch requests and like how to validate them and stuff. So instead of like a separate like routing table,
Yep.
you just annotate all the functions.
Yep.
Nodes.
Yeah, I mean, I could see the way Flask does routing, I could see very easily
Yeah.
replacing that with annotations.
It was a cool idea. I wish I could do it.
Yeah.
Six.
Yeah, exactly. It is super neat. Yes.
I have a problem with the Git. This function is not actually Git.
Okay.
So I was able to work around it by calling args directly and then parsing out names.
I think I know what's going on.
But
Yeah, let me see your. I think I know what's going on. Let me see your request object.
Oh, because that's a framework.
Yeah, so you've defined request as a function here,
Oh,
right? So if you make it into a property, then that syntax will work. Yep. You got it. Yep. Do about 5 more minutes on this section.
because my path is
I screwed up, yeah.
I'm trying to do it using just Python 3.
Uh-huh.
But I presume because there's something happening here, which I haven't quite got right.
Well, so the sort of inversion that you're doing here in turning this into a framework is that you're going to call this file, not your app.
Yep.
And then you have to set the environment variable to point to whatever your app is going to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is what I have. So
Right, so you might do some. Right.
That's the app.
Right. So first try calling Python myFramework.py and see what happens there, or Python 3 probably.
Yeah, so I think
So once you hit it, you'll probably see an error. Once you actually hit it in the browser, you'll probably see an error.
great. Yes, 500.
Yeah. So if you go back here, take a look. Key error, myFW app. Do you know where that?
Yep.
Do you know where that's coming from?
Yeah, exactly. So that's coming from
Right.
here. So I need to point.
So you need to set that in your environment. So that would look something like myFW app equals whatever your file is called, :application.
Right.
Do you understand that?
Yeah, I think so. If you wouldn't, so
No. You'll do that on the command line.
yes.
The same way you
Yep,
set Python.
exactly.
Yeah. So you do something like myFW app equals, just right there.
Equals.
So what's the name of the file that you put your
Exactly.
your code in?
I'll just confirm that. Okay, hello my.
Yep.
And it was colon.
Yep. And then the name of whatever you called the application in there. Do you remember what's in that code? So it would be a :hello. And then, well, if you leave that line and then add to the end of it Python myFramework.py. Right, because you're setting the environment before you start it. Now let's see what happens when you reload. Hey, what do you know?
Brilliant.
Do you see what's going on there?
Yeah, I do.
Because you have to tell it. You're just calling the framework, and you have to say here's my app. Here's what I want to use. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
All right, y'all. So here's what I did. So here's my app. As I said, I chose the Django-ish way of doing things. So I import a thing, and that's all I'm going to do. And now this hello becomes my app. Oh, by the way, I named my web framework BizKit because Django is a very good musician and a very good web framework. Limp Bizkit is a very bad musician and a very bad framework. Rolling Stone named it the third worst band of all time, which I think is even more insulting than being the worst band of all time, because you're not even bad enough to be the worst. You're just the third worst. Also, one of the early code names for Django was something ridiculous, I believe it was business or something, serious business, something like that. So I thought of that. So here's my framework. Request and response unchanged from before. I no longer need that decorator action anymore because I'm calling into my framework directly. So I have a Wsgi application which exists solely to call this hello object I put elsewhere. So here's the kind of the trickiest part is, because I'm going to potentially call into this for multiple different applications, this is a framework, my framework has to know what to run. So I have this BizKit app. It's the equivalent of basically Django settings module. And you can see when I run it, I have to set it as an environment variable. So I'll set it to something like hello BizKit : hello, which is like the, that's the module name and that's the class name. I've sort of copied like the G-unicorn way of doing things. And from there, it's reasonably straightforward. I import that module, I pull out the app, I create a request object, I call my app function, and then I do the WSGI stuff. And this is essentially what, if you've seen, like if you're familiar with Django, you've seen the Wsgi application. You've got the wsgi.py in your file, and it creates this Django Wsgi application. I mean, that's basically what, you know, a much shorter and barely working version of what something like Django is going to do. It's going to convert from the sort of internal APIs into the WSGI APIs. And here's how I run mine. Questions about any of this before we move on? We're going to pivot a little bit away from deep level and start moving up a couple levels of the stack to start talking about routing and views and that sort of stuff. All right. So real applications don't just have one function, right? They have many different parts, many different pieces. The most common way on the web to sort of point to the different parts of an application is by using the URL to point to different things. You know, Instagram is a good example. If I go to Instagram.com, that's like and I'm logged in, that's like my page, my timeline. If I go to /username, I see a user's page. Individual photos have the form /p/photo. If you've written a web application, pretty much in anything, you're fairly familiar with this way of sort of mapping URLs to sort of conceptual parts of the app, you know, log in, log out, admin dashboards, you know, what have you. So at some point, your framework is going to be looking at the request, maybe just the URL, maybe other attributes of the request, and figuring out what function, what part of the sort of framework app it needs to call to fulfill that request. And we call that routing. So you have another decision point here, which is about how you want to do routing. How do you want to map from a HTTP request coming in to the part of the app that is going to get called with that information? There are two primary ways, there's probably more than these two, but the two primary ways that I see most often in Python and elsewhere are match-based routing and object traversal. So object traversal works by mapping URLs to Python objects. So if you had a URL like user Jacob photos 14, that might map to some user object, you know, .get Jacob, .photos, .get 14. You're like basically, you know, calling getAtter a lot as you move down the stack of a bunch of Python objects. This requires some sort of object routing protocol. Like the framework has to know, like, you know, where does this object come from? How is it instantiated? How do I know that this is a variable and not a sub-object called .jacob? You know, how do I know to convert 14 from a string to a number? There's all these sort of, there's sort of a protocol in place here that tells you how to map down through all of those objects. This was really common, like maybe like when I first started coming to PyCon, maybe like 10 years ago. Most web frameworks worked this way. Zope did it this way. The first framework I used in Python was something called Coyote, which sort of did it this way. It's more rare these days. I don't really see it that often. Pyramid has some object traversal-y sort of things. Pyramid is an interesting framework because Pyramid kind of supports all of these options. Like Pyramid's decision around most of these choices is to pick a default but also provide other options. So it's a really interesting sort of deciding but not deciding sort of way of approaching it. One real problem with object traversal, but it makes reverse resolution really hard. You often have this concept where, like, I have a photo object. What is the URL for this object? That can be really hard with object traversal. You have to have some sort of protocol to like get from like photo ID 14 all the way back to this, and it can be weird and complicated and hard to go backwards. I think that object traversal fell out of favor in Python because it feels too implicit. There's too much magic like object lookup behavior, and it can be really hard to map to your brain. It's my opinion. I don't really know if that's, I'd be interested to know if that's completely true, but more common in Python is match-based routing, where you explicitly build some sort of a routing table that maps some form of URL pattern to a callable object. Flask probably has the best API here. You have a decorator with route, and you pass in this string, which is sort of mostly a string, but then it's got these little variables in it, bracket username, int photo ID. That's how Flask knows username is a string, photo ID is an int, and you can see that these map directly to arguments to the view function or controller. Does Flask call them views or controllers? View function, okay. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. You can have an explicit table. That's more like what Django does. You have the URL conf, which is really just a table mapping patterns to callables. You can use decorators to build it up. Pyramid, again, offers both. You can use patterns like regular. You can use patterns versus explicit like named routes. So you could say something. You could have something instead of this. You could say like app.route, user or something like that, and it would know how to turn that into a URL. You can use regexes like Django does versus more simple patterns. You may be interested in one of the things actively under development in Django right now, which is to support this style of routing because it's easier and better. In fact, we're basically copying the Flask style because it's easier. Regexes are a pain in the butt. Most Python web frameworks do match-based routing. And I suggest when you sit down to write your router, you think about that too. It's probably easier to do. It's significantly less. You can write a match-based router in just a few lines of code. But object traversal is kind of cool too, and it's interesting that it's sort of fallen out of favor. I think Web2Py is mostly does object traversal. Does anyone know? I think it does. It isn't as common. Yeah. More path, and of course Zope is still around. Because Zope is not dead. It is still super common. So next exercise, write a router. So you've got one function right now. No matter what URL you visit, it says hello name. So now write two functions. At hello/name, say hello. At goodbye/name, say goodbye. You could do this with two functions or with one function and just sort of select based on the path, but don't do that. Try to write a router abstraction that actually somehow knows how to get from this to that and how to get from this to that. All right. Did you have a question? I saw the sticker. No, okay, cool. One interesting thing you may note as you start to work on this is that your previous exercise you've somehow pointed your framework at a function. Now you're going to need to switch that and point your framework not at the function, but at the router. That's a sort of non-obvious bit that changes. Yes. Let's see. Framework is not a package. Hang on. Let me see what you're running there. Where's your actual? Okay. Wsgi framework.application. So do you have a file called framework? That's that. That's that file there.
Yeah, so I have two
Can I-
this test framework.
Yeah. Can I see? Application. Oh, you're running Wsgi. Try, instead of framework dot application, try framework colon application. Is that what you... Getting the same error? Is that working? Okay, now you're getting something a little different.
That's just misspelling.
Yeah. So I guess what Wsgi is using a slightly different syntax to specify. It's using like Python module colon Wsgi app name as opposed to twisted style, which just has the entire dotted path with dots, no difference. Yeah, so now you're getting a key error for the environment because you'll need to. Cool, yeah. Yeah, once you start getting errors, then it's easier because now you can chase them down. Cool. take about 5 more minutes on this chunk. Go for it. Yes.
I'm not sure what to set the par in my WFE.
Yeah, so depends on what, let's see, what are you doing here? So you are importing a module and then you're calling getAtter on routes.
Yeah.
So you'll want to point it to whatever the module name is that contains that routes.
Yes.
So it, okay, so you'll point it to something like hello goodbye.
Yeah, so I did that, and I think last time I actually then had a colon with.
Right.
But now I don't want that.
No, bingo.
Okay. I don't want it all.
Yep, you're just going to import the whole module, and you're sort of using a magic routes name.
Yes. Okay.
Hey, that's nice. That's your not found error.
Great.
So that's good.
So just need to remember what. So the route I want to test is. So hello.
It looks like you have hello and then like a name after it. Because if you look at your pattern, it's hello and then, yeah. Maybe try a trailing slash.
What's that?
Maybe try a trailing slash.
Here.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, of course, with my pattern.
Yeah.
Trailing slash.
Sweet.
Brilliant.
Good stuff.
Thank you. It's really cool. I really like looking under the hood.
Yeah. And it actually, like, I mean, the thing is, conceptually, this is not different from how Django really works.
Yeah.
It's, like, much worse and has many more bugs. But conceptually, like, this is basically how it started.
Yeah, well, as you said with that quotation, if you want to understand the wheels, right?
Reinvent more wheels. I love that line.
It's incredible.
I've quoted that in like 4 different talks on different topics because it's such a There's a great way to learn just by building something. Yeah.
You know this book? It's called Data Science from Scratch. It's got
Oh, that sounds great.
He gets you to just use NumPy to build a bunch of algorithms.
I know what I'm doing next week.
It's really
That's awesome.
it's an O'Reilly book.
Oh, cool. Maybe I'll pick it up here. They usually have a bunch of books here.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, definitely the stuff I've learned, you can learn how to use it, but I think that just equips you to be dangerous in a lot of ways without like looking under the hood.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to get a deeper understanding, like peeling back a few layers is a real good way to do it. Yeah. All right. All right. I will walk through what I did. So here's what my app looks like now. I wrote two functions, hello and goodbye. I chose to create a router object rather than a sort of like list of URLs like Django does. Honestly, I don't know why I made that choice. It just seemed like the easiest at the time, so that's why I did it. And to explicitly call some getRoute functions. I chose to use regular expressions, again, because I'm trying to stick to the standard library. Like I said before, I think that probably that's not the best choice for URL routing, but I didn't want to get too complex. I just stuck to regexes. Here's what my router object looks like inside my framework. Reasonably simple. Add route just appends a pattern and a callback to the routing table. So every time you call add route, it's just adding the pattern and the function to that table. And then I have a match function, which gets the path part of the URL, iterates through it, looks for a match. Here's the only clever part. If we find a match, we extract the groups out of the URL and return the callback function from our routing table along with the groups. And so what that does is the return from the match function will be this function, whatever the callback is, and then also any captured groups inside parentheses. And so that's how you basically get arguments out of the URL and into the function. That's the only kind of sneaky clever bit that's happening here. And so finally, I need to modify my application to use it. So I make a change here. Rather than pointing to a function, I point to the whole module. So I've removed the splitting on colon bit. And I've chosen to have a magic routes object. Probably not the best idea, these sort of magic hard-coded names. Every time we've done that in Django, we've regretted it eventually. So hard-coded names, probably not great, but it was easy for this example. So I just define, my app API is that it must have a routes object in it somewhere, right? So instead of calling my function directly, I now call router.match, and that returns a callback and the arguments, and then I call the callback, passing in the request and any arguments that are captured. I chose to be slightly fancy and catch a not found error and return a 404 so that I get the proper browser return code from a lack of a match. And from there, it's the same as I had before. Oh, I did have to make one change to my request object to define a .path method. And if you look at my code, there's at least 2 or 3 bugs in that attribute as well. Bonus points, stickers for anyone who figures out what they are. All right, questions about routing? Did anyone try object traversal? That's what I thought. So what you could have done if you had wanted to do object traversal is rather than calling this router.match function, you could take the module and then you could do something like split the path into components. So you'd get hello, name, whatever. And then you could do, instead of doing get@, or routes, you could do get@, and then hello or goodbye, whatever part came out of the URL. So you could kind of walk through the URL bit by bit and use get@, to sort of dive down and dig through there. If you want to try that out, it can be interesting. If you want to learn more about how Python deals with attribute lookups and the various ways you can manipulate it, an object traversal will be a great exercise to dig into really further understanding of imports and get@, and that sort of stuff. Okay, so quick procedural note. I vastly overestimated how much I like to talk, and I spent more time talking than I had expected in my timeline. So here's what and so as a result, I'm running over. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk through, I'm going to do the next part, which is on a little bit about controllers and an exercise about templates. And I'll give you a bit of time to work on the templates exercise, which will be our last exercise. Then I'll talk about data storage, but I won't spend any time on that exercise because it's a bit of a tangent and not particularly exciting. So I'll just go straight from talking about data to kind of wrapping up and closing thoughts and try to end around 10 after to 15 after, something like that, in time to get upstairs for lunch. So let's talk about structure of web applications. is this a good idea? I have Python or have HTML in my Python. Is this good? Can you imagine writing an entire HTML document like inside a Python string and working with designers and trying to make sure that the style matches between these two? Yeah, not great. Actually, the original reason that we created Django was because we needed a better way for developers and designers to work sort of simultaneously following simultaneous streams. Our original impetus was entirely about trying to separate sort of logic from presentation. That was like the entire reason that the whole thing started. And most frameworks have a similar idea, that like we want to sort of separate out some different parts of concerns. Typically, you want to separate sort of the logic, the like how the data is processed, where it's stored, all the sort of, control information from what it looks like. Most frameworks these days use abstractions that sort of are derived from the MVC idea. MVC is model view controller, even though the order that you usually write these things are model controller view. And that, those parts are typically like your model contains all your data, your logic about your data, validation information, anything sort of involved with data storage. The controller is sort of user behavior, business logic, that sort of stuff. And then your view is the visual presentation. On the web, usually there's also a template engine involved in here as well, like views and templates. Some frameworks call the template the view. Django calls what's probably more properly a controller a view, and then has a thing called a template that's probably more properly a view. The names are confusing, but the idea is that basically you separate like the Python-y logic-y stuff from the HTML bits. And that sort of brings us to our next decision point. Where should your views be rendered? So traditionally, frameworks render HTML from templates on the server side. Like Jinja is a server-side template engine. You take a template, you feed some data into it, you spit out some HTML. And this is where things start to get a little weird. You shove that HTML down a wire to a browser, which then renders it again, which turns HTML and CSS and JavaScript into something visual. And as richer web applications become more common, a lot of people are asking is whether this is still a good idea. Is it still a good idea to be rendering HTML on the server side? My opinion, I don't think it is. I think this is another place where web frameworks are really starting to show their age. It's much more common now to do this weird thing where you render HTML once on the server side, and then you have JavaScript that comes in and like moves it around and renders it again on the client side. And you see people sometimes trying to use like JavaScript implementations of Jinja so that they can render the same template server side and client side. I think the next generation of web frameworks won't look like this. I think server-side rendering is probably on its way out, and we're going to start seeing purely client-side rendering. If I had to guess, it would probably look something like the data binding approach that React takes. Yeah, I'm not sure if I think it's still a good idea on phones and tablets. I mean, right now, probably not because of the speed problem, because of the latency problem, especially in countries that have bad internet connections or super expensive data. But I think if I cast out 5 or 10 years, I can't, I see mobile devices getting more popular, more powerful. I see networks getting better, So I think if I had to sort of make a prediction, about which I am often wrong, but if I had to, I would expect that to become less of a concern. And you have people playing with stuff like React Native, which sort of compiles these sorts of applications to native applications as well. So I really think the days of server-side rendering are numbered. In the same way that request-response abstractions are probably still really valuable today, but probably not. If I was starting from scratch on something new today, it's not where I would start. Right, a lot of people begin with React rendering on the server side. I'm not necessarily saying that this is, my goal here is not necessarily to say this is the way things must be, but to sort of point to a trend and look at the fact that current Python web frameworks were created before this trend began. So it would be a reasonable thing to think about, for example, to create a web framework that is entirely API driven. You know, like probably the last 2 or 3 Django apps I've written have been Django REST framework apps. They haven't had any HTML. They haven't been entirely APIs, and everything has been rendered on the client side. And I've been liking that. But you know, if you are thinking about a traditional template sort of way of doing things, which you know current web frameworks do, you still have a lot of options. Like, how do you link together your template and your controller? Do you explicitly load a template? It's kind of Django-ish. Do you return like the template name and some data along with it? Do you specify it as part of routing? There's like a lot of different ways you could tell the framework which template to use if you even wanted to use a template. And an interesting thing about something like this model or that model is that you could potentially do both, right? This response thing could render the template if the browser asks for HTML, but could just serialize the data to JSON if the browser asks for JSON, right? So my position is that this is the anti-pattern, and something more like this is probably a better choice for newer stuff. And I suggest when you dive into the next exercise, you try doing something like this, because it's kind of neat. All right, so our final exercise of the day. Use a template engine or don't. You probably want to use Jinja. I would not recommend writing your own template engine. There's really no reason for it. Or you could just write f-strings. I'm going to use standard library string.template because I'm artificially restricting myself to the standard library. String.template is terrible. Don't use that, but that's what I used. Modify your controllers to use that template. You know, choose an approach that works for you, or don't. Try returning JSON instead. See how that works. If there's any front-end folks in the house and you have experience with React or whatever, see if you can get a little bit of data binding to work. So we will do this for kind of only about 10 minutes, and then I'll wrap up, but I'll stick around for a bit after if folks want to keep working on whatever. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's see your let's start with that. Oh no, your file that has your route the actual defines the routes in it. So your app itself. That looks about right. Let's take a look at your router function. Match. Oh, I'm not sure. You might try printing out the path and see what it is at each step or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. Could it be related to the version I'm on? I think I'm on 3.6.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think that's it. I mean, my guess is that you've got some sort of a bug. Oh no. Oh, Yeah, my guess is you've got some sort of a bug in here somewhere, but I can't see it just looking at it, so I would need to start sort of printing stuff out to debug what was going on.
Okay, I'll try and debug some stuff out then.
Cool. Yes.
I legitimately have no idea what I'm doing. So I have what I built in the previous exercise.
Yeah.
And so what I need is some sort of template, right? And I include that in the original framework, some class there. Is that
You could, or you could just use Jinja directly
Okay.
in your views.
I'd love to do that, so you suggest that. So where would I begin?
So you'd want to install, you need to install Jinja. Jinja requires the creation of an environment object, which tells it where to look for templates and that sort of stuff. That would probably be something you'd put in your framework. Your framework would probably be responsible for creating that environment, and maybe you could hang it off the request object. You could have a request.environment, a Jinja environment or something like that. That could be a place to put it. You could make it a global. There's a lot of different options about where you could put that.
Okay.
And then in your view, you'd use that environment. Jinja has like a load template is the name of the function. Yeah,
Load templates. I mean, especially for this, you could just do it from string.
that's true. You could just create the template from a string. But if you wanted to load it from disk, you would use the load template function
Okay, nice.
and point it to the file.
You have your environment, and you just do dot from string, and you pass it like a template string, and that creates a template for you that you can then call render
Okay.
Yeah.
produces.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thanks. Yeah. It's been a steady trickle. Yeah. Hope it wasn't because they were totally lost. Hope they got something out of it.
The idea is that I load this environment variable in the framework.
I mean,
Or
you
in-
could do it anywhere.
Okay.
Like, I think the more frameworky way would be to have it as part of the framework,
Okay.
right? But whatever.
And so
One thing, did you install Jinja, or did you install Jinja 2?
two. Is that
There is yes.
okay?
There is an old. If you pip install Jinja, you get something.
Full email chain with them one time, trying to convince them that we should like
Just take the name over.
Yeah.
well, because we own both names.
Right. Oh, okay. So it would be easy enough to do. You just have the setup that Pi print something like, are you sure? Is this really what you want?
Like that's ugly.
Complaining that this path exists. I don't know if we. I don't know why.
if you're taking stuff directly out of the slides, that's a thing that I added to request and didn't put in the slides. So you'll need to go ahead and add that yourself. All right, let us wrap up. So like I said, I'll talk a little more, but then I will stick around for folks who want to keep working. So here's what I did to add template rendering to my app. I did create a template response object, passing in the name of a template and what I'm calling a context, the dictionary that contains the data to render. And template response is actually a fairly simple object. I just subclass response, and I'm using string.template here. I can find the mouse. Using string.template to read in a file from disk. If I was using Jinja, I would replace this with the Jinja load template function out of the Jinja environment. And then I render using the context that's passed in. And then, of course, got to remember to encode things. I'm just doing it directly in the iterator. So actually, fairly simple and pretty reasonable. And you can probably picture how I could, I could take a look at what the request was at in the dispatcher at some point and called .json instead of that if I wanted to pull out the original data, something along those lines. So the only thing that's missing from our framework at this point to make it like a real legit framework that you could actually build applications on top of is data storage. And that kind of leads to our last decision point, which is do you want to use an ORM? ORMs, object relational mappers, are super common in web apps these days. Django includes one. If you're not using Django, you're probably using SQL Alchemy. There's a handful of others that are fairly good. Relation databases are still the best general purpose data storage engine out there and have been since like the 50s and probably will still be for another half century. And not just for relational data anymore. I mean, Postgres does an amazing job storing documents, storing XML, being a search engine. Like, if you're a web framework author and you're trying to build something that as many people as possible will find useful, relational databases are still your best bet. But, and object relational mappers sort of smooth the mismatch between relational databases and object-oriented languages. And if you're taking best of breed, yeah, like I said, SQL Alchemy is probably the way to go. On the other hand, increasingly apps require more specialized data storage. I am skeptical of non-relational databases. I don't think that, I remember object-oriented databases, and I remember XML databases, and none of these things really lasted. They got subsumed into relational databases, and I kind of feel like some of that is true of some of the non-relational database hype, but I think there's more than just hype there also, and there are certain applications where special purpose data storage makes more sense. There's probably no way to create a object non-relational mapper because the non-relational data space is just so vast. I mean, like Cassandra and Redis have almost nothing in common. The fact that they're both called non-relational databases is like calling a space shuttle and a bicycle vehicles. Like, okay, I guess technically that's true, but they don't really share anything. And inventing a new ORM in 2017 is a really good way to learn about ORMs. So this is the exercise that you can do on your own if you'd like, which is basically to add data storage to the application, to figure out how you might store some data. So make hello PyCon say, hello PyCon, PyCon has been greeted 17 times, and when you reload it'll say 18, 19, 20, and make that persist between server reloads. This is an awesome way to create a whole bunch of bugs because there's a great race condition, especially if you use SQL here. Super fun. So once you've written all these parts, including the data storage layer that I passed, this is actually really a full-featured web framework. Like, this is all that web frameworks actually do. Everything you've seen today is the fundamental building blocks of a framework. Everything else is just built on top of these pieces, or higher level abstractions on top of what we saw. So for example, let's take a look at how authentication works. That seems like a core component, but actually it just builds on everything we've already seen. So authentication system starts with cookie handling, which is a mix between the Wsgi stuff you've seen and the request response stuff you've seen. Usually you build some sort of session abstraction on top of cookies, so you have some sort of persistent dictionary that is attached to a cookie in some way. That's just cookies that you've already built plus data storage. Then on top of sessions, you need some sort of user, right? A session is not just a anonymous thing, it's Jacob. It's, you know, I am identified in some way, username and password typically. Well, that's just a session plus data storage again. And then finally, you need some controllers and views and templates and that sort of stuff for login, logout, registration, et cetera. And that's just routing, controllers, templates, more data storage, right? You could, taking just the components that we've presented in this class, you could build an authentication system on top of it with nothing else from anywhere else. And this is true of every single other component that you'll find in even a huge web framework like Django. These basic building blocks, the sort of request response bits, data storage, routing, views, templates. These are the building blocks of every web application. Should you use what we built today in production? I really, really hope not. However, should you build a new web framework? I mean, probably not. It's probably a waste of your time. There are some really, really good ones. But maybe you should, right? I mean, if I am concerned sometimes that between Django, Flask, and Pyramid, we've kind of squeezed the innovation out of the Python web framework space. So maybe this excited you. Maybe you should build a new web framework. I think a lot of choices are starting to look pretty outdated, and retrofitting something that is not request response based onto a framework that has been request response based for a decade is a really hard proposition. And of course, reinventing the wheel is great if you want to learn more about wheels. So thanks for attending and your hard work today. I know this was kind of challenging, and you should feel very good about getting through it all. So please, I would love to hear your feedback. You can email it. You can email me. You can grab me in the halls. There's like a formal link which will help PyCon, you know, better judge its tutorials, but will also help me. I'm especially, like I said at the beginning, I'm especially interested in critical feedback. If something didn't work, if something was, you know, if you got lost somewhere, if you were expecting this to be harder, if you were expecting this to be easier, all those things would be super great for me to hear. Enjoy your lunch, y'all. Thanks.